Good afternoon. I'm Ed Pozzuoli, President and CEO of Tripp Scott, and with us today is Miranda Devine. Miranda is a New York Post columnist and, frankly, one of the most independent journalists we still have in this country, and so welcome, Miranda.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Miranda, with that history, given my introduction, how do we make sure that journalism remains independent? Because it does seem that journalists, in a loose sense, is either left or right, and mostly left, but left or right. How do we maintain independence inside of the journalistic world?
Well, you're right. I mean, just in my 30-year career, all over the English-speaking world, at least, I've worked in Australia, I've worked in the UK, and I've worked in the United States in various cities, and it's really become very polarised. I think the idea of having an impartial observer as a journalist is pretty much out the window. And the New York Times, in fact, as soon as Trump came on the scene, President Trump, they publicly stated that the times for objective journalism were over because this man posed such an existential threat to democracy in
Whatever
America.
that means.
Whatever that means. So the New York Times sets the agenda for newsrooms all over the world. So that really gave the green light to this kind of activist journalism that I think has done so much harm. But I would say the good news, while not very good for the industry, the good news for the public is that they've woken up. There was a Gallup poll out recently that said that only 31% of the Americans trust the media. And of those, most of the people who trust the media are Democrats. I think 12% of Republicans trust the media, with good reason, because they've been lied to. Political hit jobs dressed up as, objective journalism have been employed to great effect over the last, say, 8 or 9 years. And I think that the public has become tired of it, particularly Republicans, because most of the hit jobs and the dishonest stories have been on one side. I am a conservative journalist, so you might say, well, maybe you can't trust me. But I think any objective view of the kind of stories that have been proven to be complete fictions, such as the Russia hoax stories against Donald
recently,
Trump.
just the 60-minute interview with Vice President Harris, where they kind of, CBS picked and chose what they wanted the response to be, or at least seems to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think of that CBS interview sort of within the bounds of sort of journalism as we knew it. I mean, it's tricky, and they've obviously tailored the answers to be as positive for Kamala Harris as possible, but she's an impossible person to interview, as you might have seen if you watched the Bret Baier Fox News interview, which was not cut, because she just filibusters. She doesn't really answer the question that she doesn't want to, so she'll just talk and talk, knowing that that will just make it impossible to run her answer complete. It'll have to be chopped up, and she would rely on people like CBS to do that in a way that's favourable to her, whereas I think if it were Donald Trump, you'd see a different sort of outcome.
Well, given that we talked about both Donald Trump and Vice President Harris, where do you see the status of this race, and inside of how it's covered, one, and then two, we're headed into the home stretch. Do you see any surprises coming out in the next couple of weeks that's going to impact this race?
Look, I mean, we've just heard that there's from a journalist, an independent journalist called Mark Halperin, that he said that he's been fed or pitched a story about Donald Trump that, if it were true, would end his campaign. He's since said, well, he doesn't believe it is true, it seems bogus. Whether or not that was the story that the Atlantic magazine ran, right, that has been, at the minute it came out, claiming that Donald Trump had made a rude comment about a fallen soldier and said that he wasn't going to pay $60,000 for her funeral as he'd promised to. And that story was immediately debunked by her family, as you said.
Right.
They said that it was not true, and they said that Trump had been nothing but kind to them and their family after the death of this 20-year-old soldier. But also people who were in the room with Donald Trump at the time with the family have also said it's not true. So I think there have been, at least 3 or 4 people that have come out and said it's categorically not true, and also have shown the emails that they sent back to The Atlantic, to Jonah Goldberg, who wrote the story, saying, no, this is not true, and their answers were not given in the way that they'd made them. And so it looks like another hit job. This is the same publication that just ran a couple of weeks earlier, this ridiculous story by Anne Applebaum saying that Donald Trump was using the language of Hitler, Stalin and Mussolini. And, Jonah Goldberg's the same reporter who wrote the Suckers and Losers story, right, that's also been debunked. That was another October surprise in 2020. So I guess they'll try to do something, because I think the Kamala Harris campaign is faltering somewhat. The joy that they started off with, which was really relief, I think, that Joe Biden was out because his numbers were terrible, that's dissipated, and in its place is really, I think, a lackluster candidate with a bunch of policies that she's wedded to from Joe Biden's time that she has not distanced herself from, that are very on the nose with the electorate, I think, when it comes to the economy, in particular illegal migration. She's not been able to answer the criticisms that that the Republicans have and that the American people have about the way things have been going.
It does appear, though, talk about the Russia hoax, but it does appear, as an example, some foreign folks, foreign elected officials or officials have been taking active roles in some of these campaigns or voicing their opinion. And one of them is Zelensky from Ukraine.
Yeah.
And, it does appear that he favors Harris getting elected. Do you have any understanding as to why that might be?
Well, he doesn't like the fact that Donald Trump has said that he'll make sure that he just wants to end the war, and he will knock heads together with Zelensky and Putin, and he just doesn't want the war to be prolonged, and says that it never would have happened on his watch, which I actually think is true. When Donald Trump was president, he was pretty belligerent. He told Vladimir Putin, love those golden domes in Moscow, it would be a shame if something happened to them. And I think Putin and President Xi and all the other tyrants and gangsters around the world weren't quite sure what to make of Donald Trump, and they thought, well, he does run the biggest military and most effective military in the world, so we better take him at his word. So they were in their box during the Trump presidency. Vladimir Putin did not invade any countries like he did when Obama was president, like he did immediately when Biden took office, because he perceived weakness. And I think that with Zelensky, it was really unfortunate for him, and a stupid thing for him to do, to recently insert himself into the election campaign by being flown in at US taxpayer expense on a military aircraft into Pennsylvania to go to Joe Biden's hometown of Scranton to visit a munitions factory with a whole bunch of Democrat politicians, including Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Bob Casey, who's running for re-election against an insurgent Republican in Dave McCormick,
right,
and struggling in that race. And there were no Republicans at that event, and they were all there blithely signing these bombs to go to Ukraine to be used against Russia. And I just think it was all around a bad look, and particularly coming after Zelensky had given an interview to The New Yorker in which, if he wasn't verbaled, which I wouldn't put past The New Yorker, but he was critical of both Donald Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance. So very stupid, when chances are that Donald Trump could be president next year. And I think it was a good thing that shortly after this Pennsylvania unfortunate visit, that Donald Trump did meet with President Zelensky at Trump Tower, and they seem to have had quite a cordial meeting. I think that's the way it ought to be. And I think it shows that Donald Trump knows that this war in Ukraine is far more important than trying to gain, petty political talking points. And so let's hope that if he does become president, that he is able to put an end to this terrible bloodshed.
But a very unusual event, though, to bring in a foreign leader.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding the controversy around Ukraine and the partisanship around it, but whether or not, that's a whole different discussion. But it's very unusual during a campaign to bring in a foreign leader to basically come in and in a swing state such as Pennsylvania,
just as they were starting voting.
Just craziness. But the connection with Ukraine and the Biden administration goes way back. In fact, you wrote a book about the big guy, and can you separate some or explain to some of us the difference between fact and fiction in dealing with Ukraine and the Biden family? Because I think that's important, because most people, they hear a lot of things and it sort of depends on who's telling you what it is, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. Can you summarize for us the fact versus the fiction?
Well, Ukraine was one of the countries that Joe Biden as vice president had carriage for. President Obama pretty much outsourced foreign policy to Joe Biden because he was very sort of experienced, having been the chairman or ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate for over a decade. And his family, his son Hunter and his brother Jim Biden, were operating this influence peddling scheme, first of all out of Delaware, that Joe Biden was involved with, and then they internationalized it when he became vice president for those 8 years. Ukraine was one of the countries that they made money from. Hunter Biden, in fact, made $1 million a year from this corrupt energy company called Burisma. He was put on the board of Burisma despite not having any expertise. And this was a real blow to America's prestige and reputation in Ukraine, a very corrupt country. But they saw the Vice President, Joe Biden, come to their country and lecture them frequently about corruption, while they also knew that his son was being paid $83,000 a month by the most corrupt company in the country. I won't go into great detail, I talk about it in the book. Donald Trump was impeached for pretty much the sins of Joe Biden, what Joe Biden had done, which was to threaten to withhold US aid from Ukraine, $1 billion worth, unless the president, then Poroshenko, fired the prosecutor, the Ukrainian prosecutor who was investigating this energy company, Burisma, that was paying the vice president's son, Hunter, $1 million a year. Now, that prosecutor has been smeared and called corrupt, and that story was clouded for many years. But I feel in my book that I've got to the bottom of it, that I've spoken at great length to Shokin and others. And he was, as far as I can tell, an honest man, an honest prosecutor. And from the material that was on Hunter Biden's laptop, you can see the pressure that Hunter Biden was being put under by the owner of Burisma, that energy company, who was being investigated at that time by Victor Shokin, the prosecutor. And from these emails, you can see that right up, leading up until where Joe Biden demanded his firing, the firing of the prosecutor, Hunter Biden was being asked and pressured, and the sort of pressure was being ratcheted up quite strongly. And we know from Hunter Biden's business partner, Devon Archer, who testified under oath to Congress, that this pressure all culminated in a meeting in Dubai in which Hunter's Ukrainian business partners, the owners of Burisma, asked him to get his father on the phone, and he got him on the speakerphone. And shortly after that, Joe Biden, for a couple of days, made a visit to Ukraine. During that visit, he demanded the firing of the prosecutor. And as soon as the prosecutor was fired and the new prosecutor came in, who Joe Biden backed and said was a solid guy, all investigations into Burisma were dropped, and the owner, Zlochevsky, who was Hunter's boss, was let off with a very small fine and allowed to come back into the country. So, you know, it all looks pretty damaging to Joe Biden, but for some reason Donald Trump didn't have good legal counsel, wasn't very good at defending himself. He was the one who got impeached for Joe Biden's problems. So that's Ukraine, but I mean, more money came from China, and I think the China issue with the Biden family and with Joe Biden as president was equally troubling, if not more troubling, as Ukraine, because having given millions of dollars...
Of China's position in the world, relatively speaking.
That's right. And, you know, China is an imperialist force in the world. It's the Belt and Road Initiative that President Xi is so fond of, and which its aim is to go around the world gobbling up small countries, bringing them into its orbit, plundering their raw materials and ensnaring them in debt traps. And the way the Biden family was useful to the Belt and Road Initiative was that Hunter was paid, and his uncle, Joe Biden's younger brother, Jim Biden, were paid tens of millions of dollars to lend the Biden name and the prestige of the vice president to the Belt and Road Initiative by this company called CEFC, another energy company, which was the capitalist arm of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that allowed, there were a lot of countries by then, you know, you're talking about 2014,
right.
2015, that were leery of China, that they felt that this was not a great idea to get involved, to accept the Chinese money, and, you know, the foreign leaders were being bribed. And having the Biden name attached to this Chinese energy company sort of laundered it and whitewashed it.
Added credibility to it.
Added definitely credibility.
And so if Vice President Harris is elected, are we looking at a Biden 2.0, administration similar to what we've seen in the last 4 years?
I think certainly in foreign policy, because I mean, the reason I wrote the book was because I'd written an initial book about the laptop from hell, Hunter Biden's laptop, and that really was just about the influence peddling and the corruption of the Biden family. But that story paled into insignificance compared to what I think was a much more serious story, which was the cover-up, which began the minute that we at the New York Post published our first stories from the laptop. In October of 2020, and that was when big tech censored us. We found out later that it wasn't just that Twitter and Facebook were woke and didn't want Donald Trump to win, wanted Joe Biden to win. It was that they had been coerced by the FBI, which had been meeting with them for weeks before the election, before our story appeared, and the FBI had pre-bunked our story and said to Twitter and Facebook to expect a story likely in October, likely about Hunter Biden, that would be a Russian disinformation, a Russian hack and leak operation. And they knew that wasn't the case, the FBI, because they'd had the laptop in their possession for 10 months. They'd very quickly verified that it was legitimate, that it belonged to Hunter Biden, that it had not been tampered with, and that the information on it was fit for use in a court of law, as it was done in June in Delaware when Hunter was convicted on gun charges. And
well after the election, of course.
Of course,
right.
Yes, exactly. But that was the FBI, and then the CIA was also involved. There was the Dirty 51 letter shortly afterwards, written by the 51 former intelligence officials, most of them CIA. But what we didn't know at the time, they said falsely that the laptop was Russian disinformation. But what we found out subsequently was that that letter wasn't just written by former officials who had nothing to do with the CIA. It was actually green-lit by Gina Haspel, then the CIA director under Donald Trump. The classification review panel at the CIA, which expedited the clearance of the letter, they saw how political it was just 3 weeks before the election, and they sent it upstairs to Haspel, and she gave it the all clear to be published immediately. And that letter was instigated by a Biden campaign operative by the name of Antony Blinken, who you might recognize, now the Secretary of State. He called up a former acting CIA director by the name of Mike Morell, who was hoping that he would become CIA director if Joe Biden won. And he implanted the idea. Mike Morell has testified to this, even though Blinken has denied it. Morell, under oath, has said, yes, that he didn't have any idea of getting this letter written with his colleagues until he got the call from Antony Blinken and a subsequent email from Antony Blinken. So that was just a campaign op, and it was done, we know from emails Mike Morell was sending around, specifically to give Joe Biden a talking point in the final debate against Donald Trump, which he used very effectively, and that killed the story dead.
Right. Do you get the sense that the Biden team and the Harris team, there's a little bit of friction between them as we head into the home stretch of this campaign?
I do. Look, I think that the same people that protected and covered up for Joe Biden are boosting and supporting Kamala Harris, and they will dictate her foreign policy just as they did with Joe Biden. But I think that what Joe Biden realised, it was about September 24 when things changed and he started bigfooting and sort of sabotaging Kamala Harris. And I pinpoint it to a New York Times article then, which revealed that Lorene Jobs, who's the billionaire widow of Apple founder Steve Jobs and one of Kamala Harris's best friends, she had, after the disastrous debate for Joe Biden, she'd commissioned some private polling and focus polling which showed that Joe Biden didn't have a chance of winning the election, and she circulated that among the other Democrat donors, and immediately after that the support for Joe Biden continuing on fell away and it became impossible for him to hang on. He was determined to hang on. I know that from talking to various people around him at the time, and he maybe would have except for the donors just walking away, and it became impossible for, Pelosi and Schumer and so on to support him. So, you notice after that New York Times article, it's almost as if Joe Biden's just done a complete about turn, woken up out of his stupor and decided that he's going to quite deliberately and quite openly sabotage Kamala Harris. On two occasions, I'll just briefly mention. At one point, she was about to go on stage in Detroit to take credit for the ending of the longshoremen's impending strike. And Joe Biden strolls into the White House press office, where the briefing room that he's never been in his entire presidency. And he just, all the cameras, all the networks switched from Kamala Harris in Detroit to Joe Biden in Washington. And he didn't really have much to say other than that he and Kamala Harris were singing from the same songbook. They were on the same page, they were joined at the hip. And that was a pretty disastrous thing for her. And there were briefings then from the campaign saying that he was pretty upset, and Jill Biden, his wife, was pretty upset too, that it seemed Kamala Harris was trying to distance herself from him, particularly on Bidenomics. She'd given a speech in Pittsburgh about economics and hadn't mentioned Bidenomics or Joe Biden once. Right. So he was rather irate about that. And then there was another occasion where she was trying to pick a fight with Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, over the hurricane.
Right.
And
DeSantis got the best of that one.
He certainly did, as he always does. No, I mean, that was absolutely ridiculous, as he pointed out. I mean, she was not someone he was going to talk to.
Simply not in the loop, right?
No, and he was incredibly busy making preparations. But Joe Biden comes out immediately afterwards, gives this sort of random press conference and says, oh, Ron DeSantis is a wonderful man, and we have a great relationship. I've been talking to him a lot about the hurricane. He does a great job. Just completely undermining what Kamala Harris had just been saying. So maybe that was a message to her, hey, you stick with me, kid, or I'm in a position to destroy your campaign. And shortly after that, you saw her make probably the biggest mistake of her campaign when she was asked, what's the difference between you and Joe Biden? She says, I can't think of a thing.
Right. And that was very telling. When she could have made some distinction if she was able. And yes. I don't think the question is, I'm not so sure there is a philosophical difference, but I'm not so she can. The question is, can she articulate the difference? That's a separate conversation.
It would take some subtlety and eloquence to do that without alienating Joe Biden.
So we're now in a home stretch. As we're watching the returns come out on election night, what should people be looking for in your view, given your insight and understanding of the process?
Look, I mean, I guess you're looking at the swing states. I mean, people are saying now that it might be days before we know the results. I hope that's not true for the sake of the country. You know, one way or the other, I think it would be much better for the country if it was a decisive victory, and if the winner of the, I mean, is this too much to ask for? A
clear-cut winner.
And the winner of the Electoral College is also the winner of the popular vote.
Right.
But, you know, it seems that certainly in recent times that Democrats have just tied up the big blue cities, and they are going to win the popular vote, because they've become, cities like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco have just become one-party states, one-party cities. So, but it would be wonderful for the country if there were really a very clear-cut winner, so that we could get over this sort of divisiveness and you know, efforts to overturn election results.
I want to thank you not only for the time, but your independent journalistic view and your courage to come out and say some of what no one else is saying. And so thank you very much. And you know, I would say the First Amendment is something that should be cherished and protected, and I hope we have more people like you, Miranda, that protect that right. So thank you.
Thank you so much.